There is a quiet, almost unbelievable truth about the map of Canada. It was not drawn by conquest alone, not by a single grand design, not even by careful long-term planning. Much of it happened by accident, by hesitation, by exhaustion, by decisions made in distant rooms by people who would never see the land they were dividing, by places so cold, so vast, and so unfamiliar that no one truly believed they would ever matter. If you look at a globe in the soft light of evening, Canada appears immense, a sweep of forests, tundra, mountains, rivers, and ice stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and then even farther north into the Arctic silence, the second largest country on Earth. Only Russia is larger. And yet, for most of recorded history, almost none of this land was deliberately pursued. Large regions were ignored, misunderstood, dismissed as obstacles rather than opportunities. Pieces of it were traded like afterthoughts between empires, given away simply because no one imagined they would ever be useful, which makes the shape of modern Canada feel less like something engineered and more like something that slowly, almost carelessly, assembled itself, like a vast quilt sewn from scraps no one else wanted. And perhaps the strangest part is this. At several moments in history, Canada came very close to not existing at all. It could have been smaller, broken into fragments, absorbed entirely by the United States, or left as a thin string of coastal colonies, separated by wilderness no one bothered to govern. Instead, through a long chain of cautious decisions, missed chances, imperial fatigue, and sheer geographic stubbornness, it became enormous. A nation stretching across 6 time zones, touching 3 oceans, containing more fresh water than almost anywhere else on Earth. A place so vast that even today, large portions of it remain unnamed, uninhabited, and rarely visited. To understand how this happened, we have to move slowly. We have to return to a time when no one imagined this land as a country, when it wasn't Canada yet, when it was simply cold. For early Europeans, the northern half of North America was not a prize. It was a problem. Winters were brutal and unpredictable. The growing season was short. Distances were enormous, with no clear paths through forests, rock, and swamp. Early maps reflected this uncertainty. The coastlines were sketched with care, but the interior faded into pale emptiness. Blank spaces filled with guesswork, lakes drawn larger than reality, rivers that wandered aimlessly across parchment, sometimes monsters. Even after John Cabot's voyage in 1497, when England made its first tentative claim along the Atlantic coast, there was no sense of urgency, no rush inland, no great wave of settlers. The reason was simple: fish. The waters off Newfoundland and Labrador were astonishingly rich. The Grand Banks seemed almost impossible to exhaust. Cod could be caught in such abundance that ships returned full within weeks. So Europeans came, not to stay, but to harvest. Temporary camps appeared along the shore, wooden stages for drying fish, simple shelters. And then, before winter closed in, they left. Year after year, this pattern repeated. The land itself remained largely untouched. Europe viewed the region not as a home, but as a workplace, a seasonal convenience, useful, but not valuable. And that subtle distinction mattered, because land no one fights hard over has a strange way of surviving intact. By the early 1600s, another empire began paying closer attention: France. French explorers and traders looked at the same coastline and saw something different. They followed the St. Lawrence River inland, drawn not by farmland, but by movement. Waterways, roots, connections. Where the English mostly lingered at the edge, the French pressed inward. And in 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, not as a grand city, not as a colonial capital meant to rival European centers, but as a foothold, a narrow grip on an immense continent. From the beginning, French survival depended on cooperation. They were vastly outnumbered by indigenous nations who already knew the land intimately. So alliances formed, trade networks expanded. The fur trade became the foundation of French North America. Beaver pelts, prized in Europe for felt hats, transformed rivers into highways. The St. Lawrence, Ottawa River, Great Lakes, and countless tributaries became arteries of exchange. French influence spread not in blocks of settlement, but in threads, thin lines following water. Forts appeared at strategic crossings. Missions emerged near villages. Trading posts dotted the interior like quiet punctuation marks. On maps, New France looked enormous. Its claims stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of the continent and far south toward the Mississippi. But in reality, its population remained small. By the mid-1700s, fewer than 70,000 French settlers lived in all of New France, an empire of ink, not people. Still, it existed, and it quietly established the first European framework across what would later become Canada. Not because France intended to build a northern superpower, but because fur was profitable and rivers were efficient. Another accident. To the south, the British colonies were growing quickly. Warmer climates, more arable land, mass immigration. Cities expanded, farms multiplied, roads spread. The contrast was stark. British North America grew dense and restless. French North America remained sparse and fragile, which meant that when imperial rivalry finally erupted into open conflict, the outcome was shaped less by strategy than by demographics. During the 1700s, Europe's wars spilled repeatedly into North America. Forts changed hands, frontiers blurred. Battles were fought in forests and along rivers that mattered little to the generals who issued orders from overseas. Then came the decisive struggle, the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that reached from Europe to India to the Caribbean. In North America, it became a fight for survival. In 1759, British forces captured Quebec after a brutal campaign. Montreal followed soon after. And in 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, France surrendered nearly all of its North American territory to Britain. Almost overnight, with a signature, an entire continental claim changed hands. Millions of square kilometers transferred without consultation of the people living there. It was one of the largest land exchanges in human history, and it happened because France had more urgent priorities elsewhere. Canada, still not called that in any official sense, was expendable. Another piece added not by ambition, but by neglect. Britain now found itself in possession of a vast northern territory, immense, thinly populated, difficult to govern, expensive to defend. It stretched far beyond anything Britain had planned to manage directly. For a time, London treated it cautiously, almost indifferently. The region became a buffer, a wide, cold space separating Britain's remaining colonies from rivals and threats. There was no rush to fill it, no master plan to unify it. Administrative boundaries were drawn loosely, often following rivers or existing trade routes. Maps were updated, regions renamed, but little changed on the ground. This land was not yet a nation. It was inventory, leftover empire. And yet, each practical decision, each small adjustment meant to solve an immediate problem, added another layer, another line, another claim. No one stepped back to admire the growing shape, because no one believed it mattered. Not yet. Far to the south, something far more urgent was unfolding. Tension, discontent, a population growing restless under imperial rule. And when that unrest finally ignited into open rebellion, its consequences would ripple northward, carrying people, borders, and unexpected territory with it, quietly reshaping everything just a little bit more. When rebellion finally erupted in Britain's southern colonies, it did not begin as a fight for independence. It began as exhaustion, taxes layered upon taxes, laws written an ocean away, a growing sense that the empire no longer understood the people it governed. By the 1770s, the 13 colonies were restless, crowded, and increasingly confident in their own identity. And when violence broke out, Britain faced a decision far larger than suppressing unrest. It had to choose what kind of empire it still intended to be. The American Revolutionary War unfolded unevenly, loud in some places, quiet in others. But its outcome would reshape the entire northern half of the continent. Because when the fighting ended, something unexpected happened. Britain lost 13 colonies, but kept everything north of them. And in doing so, it unintentionally preserved the foundation of modern Canada. The irony is hard to miss. The empire that failed to hold its most prosperous colonies would, by default, retain the largest remaining stretch of territory on the continent, not through victory, but through survival. As the war dragged on, tens of thousands of people faced an impossible choice: remain in the rebelling colonies and swear loyalty to a new republic, or leave everything behind. These were the loyalists, merchants, farmers, former officials, families who believed their future still lay with the crown. When the war ended in 1783, many loyalists fled north, some by necessity, some by fear, some by principle. They arrived in what is now Canada with little more than what they could carry. And suddenly, Britain's quiet northern territory was no longer empty. It had people. Communities sprang up almost overnight, along the St. Lawrence, in the Maritimes, in what would become Upper Canada. The population surged, and with population came permanence. This was no longer leftover land. It was refuge. The British government responded quickly, dividing territory to manage the influx. New colonies were carved out, administrative lines drawn more carefully than before. In 1791, the Constitutional Act split the province of Quebec into Upper Canada and Lower Canada, roughly modern Ontario and Quebec. Not because Britain foresaw a nation, but because it needed order. English law for English settlers, French civil law for French communities. Pragmatism, not vision. Yet each adjustment quietly stabilized the northern colonies, made them more livable, more governable, more likely to endure. At the same time, a boundary was hardening, the border between British North America and the United States. At first, it was theoretical, lines drawn on maps that few people on the ground recognized. But over time, those lines mattered. Surveyors arrived, markers were placed. Rivers and lakes became borders instead of highways, and with each treaty, that boundary grew firmer. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, and later agreements defined a border that stretched thousands of kilometers, often imperfectly, often vaguely, but firmly enough to prevent absorption. This mattered enormously because the United States, energetic and expanding, looked north, not aggressively at first, but expectantly. The idea that British North America might one day simply join was not unreasonable. Culturally similar, economically linked, thinly defended. Yet it didn't happen. Partly because Britain held on, partly because geography complicated things, and partly because, again, Canada survived by accident. The War of 1812 sealed this reality, a conflict born of tension, trade restrictions, and ambition. The United States invaded British North America, expecting an easy victory. They underestimated distance, underestimated resistance, underestimated the willingness of local populations, English and French alike, to defend their homes. The war ended without clear winners. Borders remained unchanged. And something subtle occurred. British North America realized it could survive on its own, not independently, not yet, but intact. The idea of permanence settled in. As the 19th century unfolded, Britain faced a familiar dilemma. This territory was vast, too vast. Administering it directly from London was inefficient and expensive. And so, gradually, authority shifted. Local governance expanded. Representative institutions developed. Rebellions flared briefly in the 1830s, driven by frustration with colonial elites. They failed militarily. But politically, they succeeded. Britain responded with reform, more autonomy, more self-rule, not out of generosity, out of fatigue. Once again, decisions made to reduce burden had unintended consequences. By mid-century, British North America was no longer a collection of fragile colonies. It was stable, organized, self-governing, and it sat atop an astonishing amount of land, much of it still unmapped, still lightly populated, still perceived as marginal, which is precisely why it remained British. Other empires had little interest. The United States had other priorities, and Britain was content to let this quiet northern territory manage itself, as long as it remained loyal. But there was a problem: geography. The colonies were scattered, separated by forests, lakes, and immense distances. Nova Scotia looked east. Canada east and west looked inward. The western interior remained largely controlled by fur trade companies. There was no unified nation, only fragments. And fragments are vulnerable. If they remained disconnected, they could be absorbed one by one, or simply drift apart. This danger grew sharper as the United States expanded westward. Railways pushed across the plains. States multiplied. The continent was filling in, quickly, and suddenly the empty spaces to the north no longer felt empty. They felt exposed. The Hudson's Bay Company had long controlled much of the interior, a corporate empire older than many countries. Its territory, Rupert's Land, covered drainage basins that fed into Hudson Bay. On maps, it looked impossibly large. In reality, it was governed lightly: trading posts, routes, relationships. For centuries, that had been enough. But now, pressure mounted. Settlers moved west. The United States eyed the plains. If Britain did nothing, it risked losing the interior, not through invasion, but through neglect. And so, once again, a decision was made not out of ambition, but out of necessity. The British government transferred Rupert's Land to the colonies. not because it envisioned a transcontinental country, but because it no longer wanted the responsibility. The land was handed over, quietly, almost casually. An area larger than many empires passed from a company to a fledgling political entity, and with it came a choice: either unite or fragment. The colonies chose unity. In 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. A modest beginning, not a continent-spanning nation, just a framework. But frameworks have a way of filling themselves in, especially when geography does the work. Almost immediately, expansion followed. Manitoba entered, then British Columbia, then Prince Edward Island. Each joined not because Canada demanded it, but because alternatives were limited. Geography boxed them in. Economics nudged them closer, and fear of isolation did the rest. Railways stitched the country together. Steel lines crossing forests, mountains, and plains. Not because the land demanded connection, but because without it, the country would fall apart. And every kilometer of track locked more territory into the idea of Canada. Slowly, reluctantly, inescapably. By the late 19th century, Canada's shape was becoming recognizable. Not sleek, not efficient, but enormous, and still growing. The Arctic remained distant, poorly understood, but strategically important. So claims were asserted, maps updated, flags planted on ice. Not because anyone lived there in large numbers, but because one day someone might care. And by claiming it early, Canada ensured that when that day came, the land would already belong to it. Again, accident, preemptive inertia, a country expanding simply because it was easier to keep land than to let it go. And as the century closed, Canada stood quietly on the world stage, vast, underpopulated, secure, its size no longer questioned, its borders largely fixed, not through dramatic conquest, but through centuries of cautious choices made to avoid trouble, to reduce costs, to delay decisions, which over time added up to something astonishing. A nation that never set out to be huge, but became so anyway. And as the world moved into a new century, louder, faster, more dangerous, Canada carried its accidental inheritance forward into a future that would test just how much that vastness truly mattered. As the 20th century approached, Canada's size was no longer theoretical. It was something you could feel. In the days it took a letter to cross the country, in the weeks required to travel from one ocean to the other, in the long stretches of railway where the landscape barely changed, forests giving way to plains, plains rising into rock and snow, snow dissolving into water again. What had once been a collection of distant colonies now existed as a single shape, wide, uneven, and improbably large. A shape no one had originally planned, a shape inherited more than designed. And with the new century came a quiet question, not how to grow larger, but how to hold together something already so vast. By the early 1900s, Canada already stretched across the continent. From the Atlantic fisheries to the Pacific mountains, from southern farms to the empty white of the Arctic archipelago. On a classroom map, it looked decisive and clean. In reality, much of it remained uncertain, especially in the north. There, the land dissolved into tundra, ice, and scattered islands. For most Canadians, it was a blankness, a pale cap at the top of the page, seen, rarely visited, almost never understood. But empires had learned a lesson by then. Empty spaces were illusions. If you did not actively claim a place, someone else eventually would. So even where few people lived, governments acted. Paperwork moved first, then flags, then small human presences, a patrol, a post, a seasonal station. Proof, however modest, that someone was there, that someone cared. And so Canada began, slowly and methodically, to make the Arctic visible. Steamships pushed north in short summer windows. Surveyors mapped coastlines that had only ever existed as guesses. Names were assigned to islands and inlets. Charts were corrected. Distances measured, not dramatically, not heroically, just patiently, year after year. Because sovereignty, in the modern world, was often decided not by who loved a place, but by who documented it. The work was quiet, almost bureaucratic, but it mattered. Then came the First World War. Canada's attention shifted outward. Troops crossed the Atlantic, factories retooled. The young country proved itself on battlefields far from home. Yet the war changed something subtle. When it ended, Canada spoke with more confidence, less like a colony, more like a nation. And that confidence carried into how it regarded its land. This was no longer British territory loosely administered. It was Canadian territory. All of it. Even the frozen reaches few citizens would ever see, especially those reaches. Because distance no longer meant irrelevance. Distance meant responsibility. In the decades that followed, the North became a place of gentle assertion. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police established small detachments across the Arctic islands, tiny wooden buildings against endless horizons, a handful of officers overwintering in darkness and wind, not there to control, simply to be present. Presence was the point. Each post a quiet statement. We are here. We have always been here. This is Canada. Supply ships arrived once a year, bringing flour, coal, letters, news from the south. Then the ice closed again. Months of silence. Long polar nights where the sun barely rose and the sky glowed faint blue at noon. It was not conquest. It was endurance. And endurance, over time, can be stronger than force. During the 1920s and 1930s, explorers and scientists continued northward, mapping glaciers, studying wildlife, charting currents through the maze of channels that would one day be called the Northwest Passage. For centuries, Europeans had searched desperately for that route, a shortcut between oceans. Most had failed. Ships trapped in ice, crews lost to cold and hunger. But now, the goal was different. Not trade, not discovery, simply knowledge. To understand what was already there. To fill in the last pale spaces on the map. With each expedition, Canada's claim grew quieter and stronger. The Second World War changed the North again. Suddenly, geography became strategy. Aircraft could cross polar routes faster than oceans. Distance between continents shrank, and Canada found itself sitting directly between superpowers. Airfields appeared in remote places, gravel runways carved into tundra, weather stations planted like seeds across the Arctic, small dots of light in enormous darkness, not settlements in the traditional sense, but infrastructure, proof that the North was not empty, proof that it belonged to someone. War often accelerates what peace delays, and during these years, Canada's hold on its Arctic territories tightened almost inadvertently, not to expand, simply to defend. Yet the effect was the same. The map grew more solid. After the war, modern life crept northward, slowly, carefully. Radios replaced isolation. Aircraft replaced weeks of travel by ship. Medical stations, schools, administrative centers. Communities that had existed for generations began connecting more directly with the rest of the country. For Inuit families who had always lived across these lands, the changes were profound, some positive, some painful. Ancient rhythms met modern systems, tradition and bureaucracy side by side. It was not a simple story, but it was undeniably part of Canada's evolving relationship with its size, because land is never just land. It is people, memory, belonging. And as Canada matured, it could no longer treat the North as abstract territory. It had to recognize the lives already rooted there. The Cold War intensified everything. The Arctic transformed almost overnight from distant wilderness into front line. Missile paths crossed polar skies. Early warning systems became urgent necessities. And across the tundra, the distant early warning line, the DW line, rose into existence. A chain of radar stations stretching thousands of kilometers, metal towers against snow, listening constantly, watching the horizon. These installations were not built to grow Canada. They were built to protect it. Yet once again they reinforced something subtle: presence, occupation, responsibility. The North was no longer theoretical. It was inhabited, monitored, lived in year-round. Even the most remote corners had names, airstrips, coordinates. In claiming security, Canada deepened its sovereignty, almost accidentally. By the late 20th century, the idea of Canada as a vast northern nation had settled into cultural memory. Children colored maps with an enormous white cap above the provinces. Textbooks described endless tundra and polar bears and midnight suns. What once seemed empty now felt iconic, essential, part of identity. The size that had been inherited through centuries of imperial indifference had become something else entirely. Something chosen, something protected. Then, in 1999, a quiet milestone arrived: the creation of Nunavut, a new territory carved from the eastern Arctic. Not expansion, not conquest, but recognition. An acknowledgement of Inuit self-governance, of histories far older than Confederation. It was one of the largest land settlements in modern history, and it reshaped the map without changing Canada's overall size at all, which felt fitting, because Canada's story had rarely been about adding land. It had been about redefining how that land was understood. Nunavut did exactly that. It transformed vast space into home, into voice, into stewardship, a reminder that the Arctic was not an empty crown of ice, but a living place with deep memory. Today, the Arctic remains quiet, but no longer ignored. Research stations monitor melting sea ice. Coast Guard ships patrol widening channels. Communities adapt as climate slowly reshapes the landscape. Summer routes open where ice once held fast year-round. The old Northwest Passage, once myth, sometimes briefly navigable. The world, once indifferent to this region, watches closely now. Resources, shipping lanes, strategy. Suddenly the far north matters very much, and Canada finds itself in an unusual position, possessing something others want, not because it fought for it, but because history simply left it there, waiting. And so the country that never set out to be enormous remains exactly that, enormous. From fishing villages on the Atlantic to cedar forests on the Pacific. From prairie grasslands to the still, white silence of Ellesmere Island. A land assembled piece by piece through treaties, wars, migrations, paperwork, and patience. A nation formed less by ambition than by circumstance, less by conquest than by continuity. Canada did not chase its size. It inherited it, held onto it, grew into it, like a coat several sizes too large at first, slowly becoming comfortable with the space. Tonight, if you imagine the map again, the lights of cities glow faintly along the southern edge. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Then farther north, fewer lights, long stretches of darkness, rivers frozen mid-curve, mountains wrapped in snow, islands scattered like fragments of stone, and beyond them, ice meeting sky. Still, patient, unhurried, the same vast quiet that has always been there. A country that became the second largest on Earth almost by accident, and now simply rests inside that immensity, carried forward by time, into whatever gentle changes the next century may bring.